great man is usually a woman. Know a little bit about Hazel during their first period of time. How did she support him and work with him, and how did they work as a team?
Hazel was very supportive. The first Chapman cars were built in her family's garage. She was part of the team and was right with the team much of the time. She kept things stable at home in spite of a number of dramatic adventures and problems that Chapman experienced. So I think she was a significant contributor to his ability to do what he did in the world of business and the world of racing. Bill.
Two brief questions. First of all, how did the name Lotus come about? And secondly, do you know anything much about his relationship with John DeLorean, or much later? Beginning and end.
Well, I never really, my book wasn't really about everything about Chapman. It was about his engineering and his cars, but he was very active, and I didn't mention this, in his early career, buying and selling cars. He traded his way up and made a fair amount of money by buying and selling cars. That was something that he did. And there's a story to the effect that when this or that car didn't get auctioned or sold, it had lot U/S unsold on it. They put the sign on this lot wasn't sold, lot U/S, and that could be the origin of the Lotus name. I think it's the most credible one I've ever heard. About the relationship with DeLorean, I had lunch with John in London around the time of the Chapman Alliance, and he said, Carl, we talked about merging our companies and putting Lotus and DeLorean together in one organization, because at that time John was commissioning Lotus to carry out the final design of the DeLorean car. And they were kind of kindred souls in a way, and they got seriously into this. And John said we started doing the due diligence on this possible merger, and we realized that if all the facts came out, Chapman would go directly to jail. I don't want to, cast aspersions on those no longer able to defend themselves, but Colin was a fast operator in the business world. He certainly took advantage of any angles that he thought he could work, and he did that in his car design, and he did that in his business activities. The fact that John took the engineering away from our friend Bill Collins, who was running it, and asked Lotus to do it, was a big disappointment to Bill, rightly so, because he had brought the prototype along to a certain level with certain concepts that were quite promising. No one is saying that the DeLorean car is a masterpiece of engineering. It's basically adapted from existing Lotus concepts in its technology, the frame and suspension and so on. But it's a workable car, and it was reasonably successful in its way.
How did the relationship between Lotus and Coventry Climax, how was that established, and when was it established?
Climax, that's interesting. Climax, an engineer at Climax was Harry Mundy, who was on the design team of the BRM and knew a lot about cars and racing, and the little 1.1 liter, or actually it was a 1 liter engine that they developed for fire pump racing, was quickly picked up by the racing crowd. And so people like Lotus and Cooper and Kieft started using the Climax engine in 1.1 liter form very early, in the early 50s. It was the first really purpose-built, single overhead cam, decent raceable engine that these small teams had. So it went along very well through the 1.5 liter formula. There was a kind of, Cooper and Climax had won 2 Formula One championships in a row in 1959 and 1960. So Cooper had pole position with Climax. Cooper was the first to race the Climax V8 when it became available, I think late '62. So Cooper, Climax was happier with Cooper. Dealing with Cooper was more straightforward than dealing with Lotus. But once the Lotus got into their stride in 1962, '63 in Formula One, they were in par, Cooper, and then Cooper started to fall off. So Lotus really was the standard bearer for Climax. People like Lola tried Formula One, but they didn't really get anywhere. So it was a very straightforward, we rebuild the engines, you don't pay for it, which was nice, and you have the use of them. It was not, they did not charge for the use of the engine. So unlike some of the arrangements that came up later on and that prevail today.
I've got a question, Carl. I saw Clark win the Indy in '65, and I got interested, but then along came the Turbine in what, '67 and '68.
60s, yeah.
And I associate that with Granatelli. I never even knew Lotus was involved. Granatelli was such a salesman that he had his name all over that turbine.
Well, he did. Granatelli brought the Turbine to Indy in '67 in his own purpose-built backbone frame car, which had the turbine engine on one side of the backbone and the driver on the other side. And it was phenomenal. It did nearly win the race. And in the next year, naturally, for '68, USAC reduced the legal air entry for the engine. I can't remember. There was a air entry dimensional requirement in '67, but they made it smaller in '68. So Chapman had to come up with a very clever design in order to keep the turbine competitive. The turbine was not, tremendously powerful compared to the existing engines at Indy, but it delivered, and of course you couldn't put nitro in it for qualifying. So, there were certain limitations on the turbines. And they had to run them at about 70% of maximum RPM to be able to have enough acceleration off the corners. So it was a tricky thing to do, but Chapman's beautiful design of the four-wheel drive car for '68 was the key to maintaining the competitiveness of the gas turbine, and it was a very successful piece of engineering. But then the next year, they I think lowered the entry size again, naturally. Even though the turbine never won, USAC kept handicapping it. But you're right, Andy then became the sponsor of the new cars for Chapman in '68.
I didn't even know it was a Lotus.
Yeah.
I thought it was a Granatelli.
Well, it was the first year, but the second year
okay.
it was a Lotus. Yeah,
Okay.
that's right.
And the year Andretti won '69, was Lotus involved with that at all?
No, that was a Bronner Hawk. A Bronner Hawk powered by a turbo Ford, as I recall. Yeah, I think it was a turbo Ford. And that was a famous occasion on which the car qualified pretty well. It was called in as a backup car after the problems with the four-wheel drive Lotus that I showed at the end of the piece. That was brought in as a backup car, and they qualified it. But they realized that the oil temperatures they were running were too high. They wouldn't finish the race with that car. The oil temperatures were just too high. And of course, you're not allowed to change the car between qualifying and racing in Indianapolis. But they didn't notice the additional oil cooler mounted underneath the driver's seat. They found room for one under the driver's seat and installed a sneaky little oil cooler there, and it got the job done. It was a Clint Bronner special.
Well,
Yes?
we're at the end of our allocated time. Thank you very much. Any further point you want
Well,
to
no,
make?
there's just one little point that I thought if nobody's asked about it. The term simplicate and add more lightness is associated with Chapman. But he didn't originate it. It was originated during the early 1930s in this very city. Bill Stout, the chap who designed the Ford Trimotor aircraft and later some interesting rear-engine cars, was explaining to his little cadre of engineers what he was trying to achieve. And in quite a long and elaborate way, he was discussing his objectives and his plans. And one of his engineers said, "Oh, I get it, Bill. What you mean is simplicate and add more lightness." And so it was originated at that time, and in fact the expression was carried around and went to England. Bill Stout had some correspondence with some editors over there, and so it started to gain currency. But it was applicable to Chapman, but it wasn't his expression. So that's all.
Thank you.